Abraham first appeared in the book of Genesis, and in Jewish tradition, Abraham is considered the first Jew.
So we all share the idea that Abraham was the first in many ways, the first for all of our traditions. We are descendants of Abraham, and the Dome of the Rock, that place there, Har HaMoriah, as we say in Hebrew, as Abraham was asked to bring Isaac for sacrifice.
Under the Dome of the Rock, that's that gold dome with the beautiful blue mosaics. And that stone is called the foundation stone. According to Jewish tradition, that stone was where the creation of the earth and the creation process began. It was also the place where Abraham in the book of Genesis brings his son Isaac and is tested by God.
Abraham's son Isaac would have a son named Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons founded the 12 tribes of Israel.
Through Abraham, we really discovered in many ways that God is one. Through Abraham, we know that his seed, his descendants, will eventually lead to the birth of the Messiah.
"4,000 years ago, God sent Moses to redeem the Israelites after more than 400 years of slavery in Egypt, leading them to the land that was promised to the descendants of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. On Mount Sinai, he gave them the Torah."
The Torah is quintessential in its message for the Jew because it contains the commandments, a total of 613. So the Torah is, in a sense, the Constitution, the Jewish Constitution, telling us how to live. The word mitzvah is very important in Jewish life. It's a deed, a meritorious deed.
King David of Israel had wanted to build a great temple for the Jews to worship and a place that would serve as a permanent location for the ark containing the 10 Commandments. However, God told David, "You will not build a house for my name, for you are a man of battles and have shed blood." But David prepared for the construction of the great temple. He ordered stonecutters to prepare materials for constructing the house of God. David provided stores of iron and ordered great quantities of cedar timbers from the Tyrians. After David's death, his son, King Solomon, issued the orders to build the first temple his father dreamed of. Solomon said, "You know that my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of wars which were fought against him on every side until the Lord put his foes under the soles of his feet." King Solomon assembled a labor force of 30,000 men. It took 7 years to complete the temple, and by the time it was finished, Solomon amassed such heavy debts that he was forced to pay off King Hiram of Tyre with 20 towns in Galilee. It's believed that in 953 BC, King Solomon dedicated the temple which sat atop Mount Moriah.
This is the famous mountain right in the center of Jerusalem, upon which the first and second temples, Jewish temples, were built.
The temple stood for 400 years until King Nebuchadnezzar conquered the land of David known as Israel. He seized control of Jerusalem and destroyed the great temple. Nebuchadnezzar exiled the Jews and transferred them to Babylon. This period of the Hebrews is known as the Babylonian captivity. It is chronicled in the book of Daniel and was foretold in the book of Jeremiah.
We're known as the Wandering Jews, and yes, there were times when we had some autonomy in the area for a short time, but if you look at Jewish history, we always lived at the caprice of others.
When the Persians overran Babylonia in 536 BC, Cyrus the Great of Persia re-established the city of Jerusalem, and after 70 years in exile, the people of Israel built a second temple. It took 4 years to complete. The Romans, who moved in to help rule Jerusalem and its surroundings, appointed a Roman Jew named Herod as king of Judea. Herod embarked on a massive building campaign that included expanding and renovating the second temple. It would become known as Herod's Temple.
Well, the Temple Mount, which is where the original Temple of Solomon and the second temple were built, is in the heart of the old city of Jerusalem. It is a plateau. It was leveled and built up by Herod, one of the last kings of the Second Jewish Commonwealth.
The prophet Malachi predicted that the Messiah of Israel would someday enter the temple, bringing it honor and glory. Christians believe the prophecy was fulfilled when Jesus entered the temple, as recorded in Matthew 21:12. The Second Temple stood for 420 years until the Romans destroyed it in 70 AD after the Jews' Great Revolt against Rome. Jews were banned from Jerusalem by the rulers of the Roman Empire. A lower level of the Western Wall is part of the surviving remains of Herod's complex. It is known as the Wailing Wall. It represents the holiest shrine of the Jewish world. Jews believe a descendant of David will someday return as the Messiah to restore the glory of Israel by building a third temple.
So there are those who believe the Messianic period means an individual, a human descendant of the David line will come and bring about a transformation in the world.
So the place has enormous holiness to the Jewish people. It is a place of such great holiness that the only person in the Jewish tradition who can actually approach the area of the foundation stone is a purified priest, a Kohen.
Israel and the city of Jerusalem was controlled by Christians until 638 AD, when the city fell under Byzantium control and into the hands of Muslims led by conqueror Caliph Umar, one of the most controversial figures in Islam. Umar had been a passionate enemy of Muslims until he converted to Islam and eventually became a close advisor to Muhammad. Umar's conquest of Jerusalem and the land Arabs called Palestine was remarkably peaceful. He ordered all Christian and Jewish religious sites to be left intact. When he arrived at the temple area, he was shocked to discover it in ruins. He ordered his men to clean the holy site and build a mosque, a precursor to Al-Aqsa Mosque at the Dome of the Rock. Umar believed the Temple Mount was a logical place for a mosque because it had been the site of the Jews' holy temple, which, at the time, Muslims respected. Yet the historic consequences of this decision would be complex.
Well, if we believe in the rebuilding of the temple, so yeah, you have a little bit of a problem there logistically, because you Dome of the Rock, rebuilding of the temple.
In light of the dual claims of both Judaism and Islam, it is one of the most contested plots of land in the world.
Jerusalem and that particular area of the Temple Mount is also referred to as the gate to heaven. And therefore, its holiness to the Jewish people should be understood.
By 1099, Crusaders from Europe took control of the Holy Land. They opened trade and transportation routes from Europe and even offered pilgrimages that allowed some Jews to return to their homeland. A Muslim military force from Egypt called the Mamelukes ended the Crusaders' domination of the area in 1291. Under their rule, the territory was governed from Damascus.
The original Ottoman Empire was a caliphate for Sunni Muslims.
Ottoman rule began in 1517. Palestine was divided into 4 districts, ruled from both Damascus and Istanbul. During the 19th century, Western powers such as Britain and France opened diplomatic missions. By 1870, the majority of the population in Jerusalem was once again Jewish, and the Hebrew language was revived. In 1897, the first Zionist Congress, organized by Theodor Herzl, was held in Basel, Switzerland. The movement was established in hopes of helping the Jewish people settle into their own homeland.
When the first Zionist Congress was held in Switzerland, 1897, someone wrote the following. It was Zangwill, famous writer and poet. He said, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept. We come here today by the Rhine to create a document promoting the state of Israel so that one day Jews will cry no more."
After the Zionist conference and continuing until the early 20th century, a steady flow of Jews came from Eastern Europe and settled in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 formalized British policy, preferring the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. The Ottoman Empire ended by the end of World War I, and for the first time, Palestine was under control of a Western power, Great Britain. In July 1922, the League of Nations sent Sir Herbert Samuel to the area. Samuel was instructed to facilitate the establishment of a national Jewish state.
Others determined how we would live our lives, how would we be accepted, would we be second-class citizens, would we have to pay what was known during a certain period as a dhimmi tax for the right to be like everyone else? Do we have to have houses of worship that were lower than all of the others because of that second-class status? So Israel gave us a chance to say, no longer will you be second, you'll be first, and also the understanding that other peoples would be able to live with the Jewish people.
In the early 30s, during the rise of Hitler in Germany, many professionals from the academic and business fields settled in the area, creating an expanded base for economic development, education, and Jewish culture. But the revival of the Jewish population was laying the groundwork for unyielding tensions. Arab nationals resented the flow of Jews to the area. In an attempt to settle a string of violent conflicts, in 1937 the British recommended dividing the country into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. The plan was accepted by leaders of the Jewish movement, but flatly rejected by the Arabs. There were no peaceful solutions between the two sides. The Holy Land had been conquered and destroyed, beginning with the Babylonians, Assyrians, and then the Romans and Muslims. It had been in ruins and then rebuilt for 2,000 years. The Jewish people had been spread throughout the world, but under British rule, Jews were returning to the land they knew as Israel. At the end of World War II, the British advanced the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, which included responsibility for securing the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. But without American support, the plan would fail. President Franklin Roosevelt promised Saudi King Saud that the United States would not endorse any policy regarding Palestine without notifying them first. But in the spring of 1945, FDR died, leaving Vice President Harry Truman with the burdens of a complex foreign policy. Truman faced intense opposition for any plan to create a Jewish state, all the while also facing equally intense support. Eventually, he would back the plan for a Jewish state, and in May 1948, the president announced his support for UN Resolution 181, a partition plan to divide Palestine between Jews and Arabs.
The United Nations would never have voted Israel as a state had it not been for Harry Truman, who learned from his Sunday school teaching mother at her knee that if you ever get a chance to help Israel, you ought to help Israel.
And in Israel, they realized we wouldn't be here if America wouldn't be here.
Truman wrote in his memoirs, "The question of Palestine as a Jewish homeland goes back to the solemn promise that had been made to them by the British in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, a promise which had stirred the hopes and dreams of these oppressed people. This promise, I felt, should be kept, just as all promises made by responsible, civilized governments should be kept." The Jewish Agency proclaimed independence on May 14, 1948, and named the country Israel. Besides becoming a permanent nation and homeland for the Jews of the world, the founding of Israel was foretold. Ezekiel 37:25 reads, "And they shall dwell in the land that I have given unto Jacob my servant, wherein your fathers dwelt, and they shall dwell therein, they, and their children, and their children's children, forever. And David my servant shall be their prince, forever."
That was prophesied. If you've seen pictures of the War of Independence in 48, the Six-Day War, soldiers who were somewhat secular, who were not necessarily religious, were weeping because they felt they had translated the words of the prophet.
While Israel was now a sovereign nation, the holiest city in the world was anything but independent. For centuries, people have predicted the end of the world. Through a depression that nearly destroyed a generation, nations were at war. Rulers and dictators tried to conquer the world and wipe out an entire race. But one major prophecy was yet to be fulfilled.
The rebirth of Israel in 1948 was the super sign. In other words, there have been wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and persecution of believers for the last 2,000 years. What we haven't seen happen in the context of all the other prophecies coming true is we haven't seen, until 62 years ago, the rebirth of the State of Israel.
On May 15, 1948, one day after its independence, Israel was attacked in what is known as the Arab-Israeli War. The fighting would continue until January 1949.
What happened after the 1948 war, when Israel became independent, was that Israel was invaded by at least 6 Arab armies. In the area of Jerusalem, the Egyptians were in the south. There were Iraqi volunteers. There were also the Arab Legion of what was then called Transjordan and today is Jordan.
Jordan invaded and occupied East Jerusalem, dividing the city for the first time in its history and driving thousands of Jews whose family had lived in the city for centuries into exile.